Hello, welcome back to the channel. It's me, Emmy the Cat Lady, and you join me here. We're in the Mojave Wasteland. Inside, we're just heading into Vault 11 here. So, quite close to the 188 trading post. So, this is going to be the new Science of Fallout series starting this week. And we are going to be delving into some psychology. So, different science, as you guys probably know by now. My background is in veterinary medicine, so I've done some like behavioural studies and things. Psychology is always a subject that I've found quite fascinating, but I don't have any kind of formal qualifications or anything, but I do like to read things, so I have learned quite a bit just from that kind of thing, and I think it's a very interesting topic to cover in the context of the vaults in Fallout. So obviously we know that Vault Tec built their vaults to carry out experiments on the residents. It was never really about saving people, and there's barely more than a dozen vaults that are control vaults, which is where there was no experiment. So in scientific terms, a control is a standard situation where nothing has been changed, and then it's compared. That gives you a benchmark. So when you change a variable, you've got some point of comparison, essentially. So ideally in any kind of scientific process, you would only want to change one variable at a time so that you've got the best comparison, because if you add multiple variables, it becomes more difficult to assess which of the variables had an impact on the result and the findings that you've got. So it's a very important part of any kind of scientific process is to have a proper control set up. But there was only really a handful of the vaults that were acting as controls for Vault Tec, and almost all the rest of them had some kind of experiment going on. And I've already kind of covered the vaults. I did a series on each vault and what happened and what the experiment was and things. So I'm not going to rehash all of that, but it's more looking at the kind of psychology behind the outcome in these vaults, what basically caused the thing to happen and what actually happened, rather than what Vault Tec were looking for or what they expected to happen, in essence. And we're going to use some real world psychological experiments and things as well to kind of evaluate the stories that we can uncover in the games and take a look at what it tells us about human behaviour. So going to be very, very interesting. So in terms of the scientific method, an example would be like a drug trial. So if you've got a placebo controlled study, what that means is that you'll have two groups of test subjects. One group is given the actual medication that's on trial, another group is given a placebo, which is basically harmless and has no effect. So you would use like sugar pills, or you would just use, something that doesn't do anything at all. And oftentimes if they do it, they call it a double-blind study, so nobody knows which patients are getting the real drug and which patients are getting the placebo, and then they'll be evaluated for the effectiveness, and that way you can see if the outcome confirms that the drug is actually doing something. Is it doing what it's supposed to do? Is it changing whatever parameters you're measuring? And of course, no scientific conclusions can be based on one single study or trial, but that's kind of how this research is carried out. And there'll be numerous different trials for different things, trying different dose rates, trying different dosing methods, assessing whether a tablet should be given with food or on an empty stomach for better absorption, assessing for different side effects, all that kind of stuff. So it's a long process, and there's a lot of research involved and a lot of different studies to put together before you can come to a conclusion, essentially. And when we're looking at modern science, there is a lot of kind of ethics and safety evaluations factor into that for obvious reasons, especially if you are using, live test subjects, be it human or animal or insect, I guess. There's a lot of mantises in this vault. There is a lot of traps in here as well. If you're wandering about and you haven't been in here before, just keep that in mind. I'll probably stumble into several of them as we go. But yeah, when live test subjects are involved, then researchers are subject to a lot of oversight. They have ethics committees, and they have to have, kind of monitoring for welfare and things, even for animals, but also for humans. And historically, that wasn't always the case, especially in the fields of things like psychology and sociology. Some experiments were carried out with less consideration to any potential impact on the test subjects, and that kind of thing. So we are going to look at some of these Vault experiments, and we're going to see what the results were and take some real life studies and real life incidents to help us kind of draw some conclusions. I will preface before we go any further, these videos, I'm going to give you a trigger warning for certain things. We will be digging into some pretty heavy mental health topics. We will be talking about certain horrible things happening in the past, and we're going to be talking about, things like simulated torture and sometimes some pretty unpleasant things. So just keep that in mind going forward, that this could be upsetting for certain people, and if it is too much, then I'm not going to be offended if you don't watch, because looking after your own mental health is extremely important, and some of these topics and some of these things could get a bit upsetting for people, but I do think it's an interesting, and I think it's a worthwhile thing to be talking about. So we're here in Vault 11, and the experiment is one of the darkest in all the known vaults in Fallout. We know kind of what happened here, and the outcome, and the posters here actually tell us quite a bit about the story. But essentially what happened is that everybody came to the vault when it was activated, like, oh no, the Dukes are coming, get to the vault, and all the people got here and they were admitted to the vault, and they went through their orientation and all the other corporate nonsense that Vault Tec insisted on. And the overseer at that point, once everybody was already locked into the vault, explained to the residents that there was a rule in this vault. They had to choose someone to sacrifice their life every single year, and if they refused, then the vault's life support would be turned off and everybody would die. So they had essentially no choice, because they going to willingly sacrifice a member of their community for the common good, because they've been told if they don't, then everybody dies. So let's forget for a minute that we know that this was all a ruse, and let's look at what actually happened. So the residents were certain that they had no choice but to make this annual sacrifice in order to survive, and the authority figure in charge of their lives insisted on it being Vault Tec. Vault Tec essentially owned all these people's lives at this point. That was always Vault Tec's goal, as we know. And the residents had no reason to disbelieve the instructions, but they obviously did have a choice on whether to comply or not, even if it would cost all of their lives. So something like that is what's called collective punishment. You might be kind of familiar with the concept. I think most people are, where essentially an entire group or community of people are punished or sanctioned for actions of members of that group. And the group can be anything from an ethnic or political group to family, friends, associates of the perpetrator, entire cities, or even countries. Any kind of group of people that have something in common, collective punishment could be used against them. I remember, obviously minor in the grand scheme of things, but examples of this kind of thing happening in school, where if one person did something wrong and nobody turned them in, then the whole class would be punished in some way. And it's highly unfair, because people should be held responsible for their own actions, but not for someone else's if they had nothing to do with it. But the idea behind the collective punishment is that it acts as a deterrent. It makes people in the group monitor other members to prevent them from doing something wrong. And you can see how it might be effective, because people don't want to suffer for someone else's actions just because they have this one thing in common. A fairly famous example in history is what happened after the Boston Tea Party. So the British Parliament in 1774 passed the Intolerable Acts to punish the colony of Massachusetts. That took away self-governance and rights, and the goal was to make an example of the colony for the other colonies. And of course, as we know, that didn't really go too well for the British, and the US declared its independence in 1776 and fought to break away from British rule, which happened 250 years ago almost. We're a month away, I think, from... Yeah. Well, no, actually, it's less time than that now. We're only a couple of weeks away, so, 250 years ago. So it didn't really go well for Britain, unsurprisingly. It was also used by the Nazis in World War II, even against German people. So family members of Germans who were accused of acting against the state were punished as well. They called this Sippenhaft, and it was also enacted against Germany after the war and within the Soviet Union, and still potentially relevant in the modern day as well. It is against the Geneva Convention. So, Common Article 33 of the 4th Geneva Convention and Article 4 of the Additional Protocol 2. This covers all armed conflicts and basically makes collective punishment a war crime. And unsurprisingly, collective punishment isn't popular among the people that it's been used against. So when the overseer of Vault 11 told everyone this, the residents were angry, understandable, and the overseer became the representative of the authority of Vault Tec, and so they made the decision that since they had been lied to, the overseer was going to be the first sacrificial lamb. And they decided to do it all democratically. The role of overseer was forever entwined with the annual sacrifice. Every year they would hold an election for the next overseer, who would then go to their death at the end of their term of office. And that led to factions developing. And they formed these voting blocks that would nominate candidates based on their goals and opinions. It devolved into nastiness very quickly. The bloc leaders came to have significant influence, and corruption followed. And we like to believe ourselves to be good people who wouldn't do horrible things even if we were told to. We're usually inclined to assume that if we wouldn't do something, other people would be the same. But history and psychology disagrees. So we're going to take a look at the Milgram experiments. So these were conducted at Yale University in the 1960s by Stanley Milgram. And essentially what happened was he wanted to explain why people were willing to obey authority figures and do things that were against their conscience because someone important told them to. So essentially he was looking to try and explain the psychology of genocide and whether it was valid for Adolf Eichmann and several other Nazi accomplices to claim that they were just following orders to absolve them of the role they played in the atrocities that were committed. Now, the applicability of this experiment to the Holocaust and the conclusions of the studies are heavily disputed, but it's still something that I think is interesting to look at in terms of, what happens with people when they are told to do something by an authority figure and how far people are willing to go. So the experimental procedure is fairly straightforward, kind of on the whole. So the procedure involved 3 people. The person in charge, who was the experimenter, they played the role of the researcher, wore a lab coat, whole 9 yards, very scientific, and they were in the position of authority. And then you had the volunteers, who were the test subjects. They played the role of teacher, but they were the test subjects, so they were the people being studied. And then they had an actor who was pretending to be a volunteer, who would play the role of the learner. So the people were told that they were studying memory and learning and the effect of punishment on a person's ability to memorise things. They were told that they would be paid for doing this job regardless of what the outcome was. And they were to draw papers to choose which role was which, but that drawing was obviously rigged so that the test subject was always going to be the teacher and the actor was always going to be the learner. So the learner was in on the game, essentially. So teacher and learner were taken to a room where the learner was strapped into a chair that kind of resembled an electric chair. And the teacher would be given a shock themselves so that they knew what it was going to feel like for the learner. The teacher, who remember is the test subject, was then taken into an adjacent room so that they could communicate but they couldn't see each other. And the teacher would then be teaching a list of word pairs to the learner, and they would be then tested on the pairs. And every time they got an answer wrong, which the actor was told to do deliberately, they would get a shock. So the teacher would press a button to administer a shock, and it was going to increase in voltage for every wrong answer, starting off at 15 volts and then progressing by 15 volts every time until it maxed out at 450 volts, which is actually far beyond the fatal kind of limits for what voltage the human body can handle. The learner wasn't actually being shocked, but there were sound effects, and as the voltage went up, the learner would start protesting, banging on the wall, shouting, and in later experiments even pleading for mercy, claiming to have a heart condition, before falling silent at the highest voltages as if they were dead. Yeah, like this little ratty here, so they would pretend to have died. And if the test subject who was acting as the teacher wanted to stop the experiment, then the researcher, who was dressed in a lab coat to make them look more authoritative, would prod them to keep going, and they would start off by just saying please go on, to the experiment requires that you continue, to it's absolutely essential that you continue, up to you have no other choice, you must go on. So they would only progress through these more extreme prompts if the previous one was unsuccessful. If after that the test subject was too upset and insisted on stopping, then they would allow them to stop. Otherwise the test wouldn't finish until the maximum 450 volt shock was administered 3 times in succession, which if it had been real would have been enough voltage to kill and then reanimate the person. And the experimenters had other scripts to keep the person going despite their protest. And one of the most interesting things is that before he did these experiments, Milgram asked 14 senior psychology students to predict the results for 100 subjects. So, asking how many people do you think are going to go all the way with this, and their average kind of responses was they expected maybe 1.2% of people would go up to the maximum voltage, and many other people that he asked said the same. Really, they just assumed that most people, no matter what they'd been told, wouldn't go that far and do that. It basically shows that everyone that he asked has too much faith in humanity, because that is definitely not what happened, not even close. And he originally planned on using American participants to be the control group and then running the same test on German people, because he thought that they would behave more like Nazis, which is questionable at best. But he didn't actually get that far, and when he saw the results, he got a bit of a shock, pun intended. So essentially, the subject showed signs of discomfort while administering the shock, so sweating, trembling, stuttering, biting their lips, nervous laughter, all signs of kind of adrenaline surge and increasing anxiety. The laughter you might think is a bit out of place, but some people do laugh when they're anxious or uncomfortable. It's, that kind of nervous laughter. It's a fawning response to adrenaline. So when you're fight or flight, because there's actually several F's involved in that system, so you've got fight, flight, freeze and fawn. So nervous laughter can be part of that process as well. And every single person did question the experiment at least once, but most of them continued after being reassured, and I mean most. not one or two, most of them up to 91% in one of the experiments, and the average across the board was about 60% of people that continued. So in later experiments, they removed the experimenter from the equation up to a degree which reduced compliance. So what they would do is that the researcher would talk to them by phone instead of being in the room with the test subject. So actually, interestingly, what happened is that some of the test subjects then pretended to continue the experiment but didn't press the button. So it's kind of like when you were doing a test at school and the teacher leaves the room and trusts everybody not to cheat, but you know somebody's going to cheat because they can get away with it. And that's what people did. So they cheated and they pretended to keep going but didn't keep going, which is you know, kind of funny but not surprising, because they obviously want to do what they're supposed to do, but they feel uncomfortable. So given that they could get away with faking it, that's what they did. And there was a later variation of the experiment which unfortunately did involve a real puppy that would get real shocks but harmless shocks, and people were still obedient but they were visibly upset by the procedure. I mean, you would feel bad about hurting a puppy, especially because that was real, okay, harmless, but you know, that just means that it wasn't going to kill the puppy, but still, you know, pretty mean thing to do. But again, you're seeing people kind of get distressed about this kind of thing, and I kind of wonder what's it really telling us. There's a lot of ways that you could interpret these results, but what it does show us is that people will do things that they are uncomfortable with if they are told to do so by someone with authority. So if people believe that someone has authority over them, they are more likely to do what they're told, even if it's something that makes them uncomfortable or seems wrong. They are less likely to question it, and that people can be convinced to do unconscionable things at the expense of someone else if they are pushed into it. And it also makes me think that people are going to find ways to justify doing things that they don't agree with. You know, people will find reasons to explain why they did something horrible. But I wonder if in Vault 11, the decision to make the overseer the sacrifice every year due to the outrage about the experiment was because they have to sacrifice someone. They might as well make it someone they think deserves it, because they'll find it easier to live with that decision of sending that person to their death. And we do see that in the subsequent elections, people essentially picked whoever they would feel the least guilty about killing, and Kate Stone committed murder because she knew that if she did that, they would have no choice but to elect her as overseer, and because it's essentially an execution. And she does state this in her deposition in an interview here. So Catherine Stone, and the whole kind of situation where she was coerced into providing sexual favours for certain people so that they wouldn't nominate her husband, but they did it anyway. And essentially, when she found out of this, so she decided to kill him. She thought their majority is pretty slim. If she thinned things out a little, someone else might get elected. And then she says, no, I expected to be caught. That was my best chance. Now they'll elect me, because they have to pick somebody and live with their reasons. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened, is that she was elected, and then she did away with the election system entirely. She was definitely playing chess while everybody else was playing checkers, but we'll get back to that later on. But when you're on the outside of these situations, it's quite easy to sit there and pass judgment and think, no, there's no way that I would do that. But Milgram did prove that people often do believe better of other people. We assume that most people are going to do the right thing or would refuse to do the wrong thing, and that's what most people who were asked to predict the results thought, that very few people would go all the way administering lethal shocks while being begged for mercy. But that's the opposite of what happened. And I think letting people have authority and power over others, it can highlight some of the worst traits in people. And most of us believe ourselves that we're immune to the corruption, but that's clearly not the case. And depending on how you approach things, you can make it quite easy to justify doing unspeakable things. So coming back to the Holocaust again, it's obviously a major thing in history, and I think it's something that we shouldn't be avoiding talking about, because we need to remember what happened so that we don't repeat the same mistakes. But it didn't start with the gas chambers. It didn't start with rounding people up and shipping them off. It started with Jewish people having to be registered, and then they had to wear something on their clothing that marked them out as Jewish in public. So they were highlighted and othered and separated from other people. And then they had their citizenship revoked. That would then justify arresting them, taking them away from their homes, and then it eventually progressed from there. And it's scary how easy it can be to take things to the extreme by doing it so gradually that people don't really notice how extreme it's getting. It slowly kind of escalates until you're getting away with doing some really, really horrendous things. And there is an element of that in this Vault as well, because the way the people separated into these voting blocks, and then Roy Gottlieb, who was kind of the most problematic, he was the leader of the largest voting bloc, and because he then had so much influence, he figured that he could just do whatever he wanted. So he started basically bribing Catherine Stone, saying that if you do this for me, we won't nominate your husband. And she gave into that because she didn't want to lose her husband, obviously. And then he went and did the thing that he promised he wouldn't do anyway, and was somehow surprised when she was angry about it. But, and he thought he could just get away with doing that and, treating her like that, doing whatever he wanted, because he had so much power and influence. And that's the thing. I mean, there are people that do have good leadership skills, but there's also a lot of people that get leadership roles that really shouldn't be in them, because they just don't have they're prone to this corruption and prone to taking advantage of their situations and taking advantage of other people once they have a bit of authority and have a bit of influence. And that brings me to another experiment which I think is relevant here, and that is the Stanford prison experiment. So that was also a pretty horrendous one, and that kind of involved basically a simulated prison and examining the behaviour from prison guards towards the prisoners. So we'll pick that up because I think time's getting on a bit here. There's a lot to talk about in Vault 11, as you can imagine, and a lot of relevant experiments to talk about. So we'll pick up with that next week, I think. I say I'm having to cut things a bit short today. I'm going to get my COVID booster tonight, so I was hoping to make this video longer, but I'm not going to have time to do it and get it all edited and stuff and get it out on time if I finish off Vault 11 today. So we'll pause here for now, and next week we'll pick up with the rest of the experiments and the stuff to talk about in Vault 11. So we'll be talking about the Stanford prison experiment, and then there's a couple of other interesting aspects to have a look at, so that'll be next week. So thank you so much for watching. As always, I do love to hear your thoughts on these things. I think it's a very very interesting topic, and I think it's one thing about when it comes to human behaviour and psychology and things is that there's not really a one size fits all, and there's no one right answer, and people are different in how they approach things, how they feel about things. So it's kind of what makes it interesting, is that different people are going to approach things differently as well. And I'll get in that. Especially I want to talk a bit more about Catherine Stone and what she did, because it was masterful, actually. Makes you know, I really, really like the way she handled the situation, in essence. So we will get into more of that next week. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time. Bye.